So the earliest written source that exists from the Torah, the earliest fragment, is a Birchas Kohanim stone that they found recently in archaeological digs in Israel.
No, not stone. I'm talking about the Torah. What is your earliest source?
The earliest source for any part of the Torah?
No, the whole thing.
Or the entire scroll
the whole
of
thing.
the Torah? So it depends in which form you have it.
Yeah,
right?
any written form.
So in a written form of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we don't hold to be authentic, but does exist as a proof that the tradition was still going at that time.
Yes.
So that takes us to about 200 years before the Covenant, something like that.
All right. So great. So between that and Moses is 1,100 years, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. You're talking to me about historicity? Oh, this is ridiculous, bro, man. You started this conversation saying your hadiths were narrated 200 to 300 years after Prophet Muhammad, which is false. We showed you it's false.
Well, if you're a Muslim, don't you believe that Jesus was a prophet?
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me.
I bet that if you were talking to a messianic Jew, you'd be using different arguments. And the Torah of Moses was the first book that was written. All of the rest of the Jewish scriptures mention the book of Moses in existence, in description, in reference, were written from Joshua's time just after Moses, all the way up to 200 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were translated into Greek in Alexandria by the Ptolemies. That's the Greek Septuagint, in the 4th century BC. Were they not translating the Torah at that time? That's a proof that it existed 100 years before. Where people came back from Babylon, they translated it into Aramaic, also with commentaries about it next to it. That's the Targum. What were they translating? Apparently the same thing. That's 200 years before that. And we have those. They would have been translating the same book, unless you're going to say that they invented those ones too. And if you would say that, there's even worse afterwards. There's even better that comes afterwards. During the Assyrian Empire, the Samaritan group also have the Torah of Moses, and after that point, they stopped conversing with the Jews. We have the Samaritan Pentateuch. It is the same book, and it's even used in translations sometimes.
If you don't understand the difference between the earliest manuscript evidence, that you have access to right now,
when is the earliest manuscript?
The earliest access you have is 2,000 years ago.
When is the earliest manuscript evidence of the Quran?
It's around now, right? The time of Muhammad, right? The thing in Cambridge.
30 AH in Birmingham.
Yeah.
Okay, 30.
Birmingham.
So between the Prophet Muhammad's death and the codified, it's like 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, no problem. No problem. This is reasonable, guys. This is very reasonable. When I say the first manuscript evidence is 1,100. Brother, this is not reasonable. I believe in Moses.
Yes. But only because
listen, no.
Yes.
Don't tell me what I believe, brother.
Really?
I don't tell you what you believe.
So you believed in him without Muhammad?
Yes, there's evidence of Moses. I can give you that evidence without Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The evidence, for example, Merampata, Ramses II, after him, he had someone called Merampata. He had a stele. It's called the stele of Merampata. And in the 19th line of that stele, it's a rock written in hieroglyphics. And it mentioned Bani Israel.
Yes, and there's also the Ipuwer papyrus that was discovered when you have an Egyptian person lamenting all of the plagues that happen in Egypt at the time of the Exodus.
Even there's extra biblical evidence of David himself. Have you heard of the Tel Dan stele?
I've heard of it.
Okay, it's a stone, it's a rock, which it goes archaeological evidence, which says that Veta, how do you say David again? David, yeah. Veta, it's Beit, isn't it? It's his house. How do you say house?
Bias.
How do you say house?
Bias.
Is it bias?
Or bias.
Bias. We've got the Tel Dan stele. The Tel Dan stele is extra biblical evidence of the existence of David.
First of all, thank you very much for saying that. I didn't even know. A lot of the scholars for the Bible are sort of letting us down at the moment.
The majority of scholarship does not believe almost anything that the scriptures teach, because they're secularists, they're naturalists, they're materialists or whatever else.
But as a historian of the Bible, I think there's very little that's factual.
King David?
No.
And Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who is the teacher about the Bible at the University of Exeter, is an atheist. That's what you would be told, and that's what we would be going to school for. But there are supposed Christian Bible teachers who are sort of going the same route.
And most of them believe there may have been a tribal chieftain named David, but we don't have almost anything he ever wrote either.
And that's James White. His testimony is that he went to all those schools and now he knows what kind of thing they're teaching, and he can actually tell us what's going on with all of this, which he has done a lot. But as I've ended up finding out, James White has also been dropping the ball on a lot of things too.
Just like the Merempata stele is extra biblical evidence to the existence of the children of Israel in the time of Egypt. So I don't need the Bible even to believe in these prophets. In fact, to be honest, if this wasn't even there, I'd still believe it because of the Quran. However, these things bolster my belief. Imagine if us coming to Speackers Corner as Muslims, and the first Quran that we have printed in print was from the time of Victorian era. What would these people say about us? So your religion is 1,100 years, the first person wrote it, about a fictitious man that didn't exist 1,400 years, 100 years before. Bro, what you're saying is nonsense, bro.
Speaking of historicity, what about the nature of what's written in those books themselves? Muhammad says the Kaaba was constructed at the time of Abraham, and that the temple in Jerusalem built by David's dynasty were constructed one after another, decades in time apart from each other. Between Abraham and King David and Solomon, there is the period of Isaac, Jacob, the Exodus, and other periods until we get to King David. Crucifixion is said in the Quran to be in Egypt at the time of Moses, but at the time of the Persian Empire, it didn't exist yet. In the time of the Book of Esther, it was impalement that is practiced, which is the antecedent version of crucifixion. The Carthaginians practicing it, which is at Tunis today, nothing to do with Egypt. And the Carthaginian Empire did not rule over Egypt either, and the Romans took over the Carthaginians and used it themselves. The Quran talks about David using chainmail. Chainmail coats were invented by Celts who lived in today's France, Switzerland, and Belgium and Ireland, in a period centuries after the time of David.
This must now be finished.
No, Ramesses. It is only beginning.
The Samaritans are a people group established in Israel during the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC. But Surah 20 shows Moses discussing with Samaritans. Moses had a brother named Aaron and a sister named Miriam. Their parents were named Amram and Yochebed. Now Jesus' mother is a descendant of the children of Aaron. She must be because her aunt Elizabeth was. But Jesus' mother is also called Miriam. Mohammed misinterpreted these two Miriam to be the same woman. And in Surah Imran, Jesus is in a family of prophets, and his grandfather, Mary's father, is called Imran. In the epistles of Paul and Jesus' disciple John, they warn about heretics trying to deceive Christians, telling them that Jesus was not even human and come in the flesh at all. According to Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp, disciple of John, there were people who were changing the texts, including the mark of the beast, to the number 616.
This manuscript is the oldest manuscript for Revelation chapter 13. And it has, at Revelation 13:18, the number of the beast as 616.
The Muratori fragment found in Italy warns about 2 forged Paul's letters, promoting 3 of these people's doctrines, Basilides, Valentinian, and Marcion, who said that in fact there were 2 gods, and that baptism is only accorded to virgins and divorced women, and that being born was a bad thing. And according to Tertullian, we're editing out a verse in the Gospel talking about Jesus' mother and brothers, because they didn't want to talk about Jesus' biological reality.
Passages have been added and removed. Matthew 12:47 also isn't in our earliest New Testament manuscripts.
The Gospel of Judas is first mentioned by Irenaeus, a church father living in what is now France, and he was the Bishop of Lyon, who was writing his book against heresies around the year 180 or 185. And he mentions a group of Christians that had a Gospel of Judas, and what he says about this Gospel of Judas seems to coincide with this book that's now been discovered.
In which Jesus revealed to Judas
the mystical, Gnostic secrets of the universe, culminating in a simple directive.
Truly I say to you, Judas, you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me.
Somehow there's an understanding that the inner man has to come out, the inner person, the individual inside of bodies of flesh must be released.
He must be, as it were, taken out of the prison. Now that's a different theology. It presumes that Jesus is the Spirit. He's not a true human being. His body is simply a fleshly encasement.
Irenaeus warns that forged false gospels, like the Gospel of Judas, to promote their message, 3 of which ended up being read in church liturgy for a time. A whole host of them was discovered at Nag Hammadi, including the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, all promoting their worldview with many invented stories.
We've got 16 non-canonical Gospels emerging in the early days of Christianity, all of which purporting to tell the story of Jesus. Yet they're all different stories, and the early church banned them all as completely heretical.
According to Irenaeus, Basilides tells that one of the 2 gods tried to kill Israel, and the second of the 2 gods sent Jesus to be killed instead of the people by all the nations, and he seizes Simon of Cyrene, a man mentioned in the scene of the crucifixion in the Gospels, who later converted, and turns his appearance into his own, and himself into Simon's appearance, and Simon is crucified in the place of Jesus. Irenaeus also says that these people invented a story about Jesus disputing about the Hebrew alphabet in the temple as a child. And in the forged infancy Gospel of Thomas, they discovered this story in it, and in the same book we find a story about Jesus being told off by Joseph for making a clay bird on the Sabbath, and he turns it to life to show that since he's God, he can work on the Sabbath all he wants. And later on, another gospel was written based on this false gospel called the Arabic Infancy Gospel. That one added in that Jesus, as a newborn, was able to speak and excuse his mother, witnessing he was indeed God in the flesh, and his mother had not been promiscuous.
Justin Martyr accepts as gospel the story of Jesus being strong like a giant to run his course around the world. Where the hell is that story? What was he reading back then? Where did any of these fanciful tales come from?
If we find Christian authors like Justin Martyr talking about these things as fact, being deceived by these people, it doesn't matter, because Justin Martyr is a man talking to us about what he knows about God, and not speaking from God. But Mohammed talks about some of these things as a fact, as you know, in the Quran, and he claims to be a prophet.
Don't say false prophet.
We also know the heretic Arius influenced Islam, and if Nicholas, who slapped Arius, had been written about in the Quran, he might be living at the time of the Maccabees and having jinns helping him out to prepare presents for children. The historical fact is that Jesus died on the cross, according to the 4 Gospels, the Talmud, the Jewish historian, and the Roman historian, but the Quran says it didn't happen, and was only made to appear so. Therefore, a Muslim da'i, without wanting to, has become convinced of the historical fact, and a Muslim stabbed his hand.